思議な絵の世界へ。
So a new Atelier game came out this week, and anybody who knows me knows that that is an exciting week indeed. I do love this series. I have been playing it since the PlayStation 3. I got into it a bit late because we didn't really get these games in Australia until then, but since then there has been 9 releases, and most of them have also been released on PlayStation Vita, and I have played the lot of them on both PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4 and PlayStation Vita. I do love the series. It is no exaggeration to say it has become my favourite JRPG series by a long way, and I really do get very excited every time a new one comes out, which is good for me because they do come out yearly. They really do push them out over at Koei Tecmo and Gust. But the reason I'm doing this video is because I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about a theme that I tend to talk about quite a bit, but it's a theme that kind of keeps recurring and keeps coming back, and it's something that I feel the need to keep talking about because it is something that I feel the games industry doesn't look at very closely or really kind of discuss as much as it should. And for me, the Gust games in particular are the perfect example of what I tend to talk about. Now, the topic is art direction versus technical proficiency, and if you look at any of the AAA blockbusters, you know, stuff like Horizon, God of War, which comes out this month, Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto, any of those kinds of games, the technical proficiency that goes into making the art of those games is very clear for everybody to see. These studios spend an awful lot of money on them to make them as good as possible, and you would hope that that investment is returned, and in a lot of cases, if not most cases, it is. They tend to be very good looking games, and you know, people respond to that as such. You know, a lot of the reason that the AAA space is the one where most of the people buy their games is because it is very visually attractive and immediately appealing when you see it in the screenshots and whatever. But if you fast forward over to the smaller development budgets, studios like Gust, independent studios, mid-tier, all of that kind of stuff, the conversation is never about how good the games look. They're often quite good games and quite well received, but people rarely talk about the visual appeal of these games, especially in comparison to the AAA and whatever, because on a technical level, obviously they're not as proficient, they don't have the budgets behind them, and they simply don't look as technically detailed. I mean, you can see it in this. What you're seeing in front of you is the new Atelier game, and I mean, if you were to put screenshots of it side by side with Horizon, it would be quite obvious which one is the more technically proficient game, which one had the bigger art budget, which one had the largest studio working on it. I mean, there's no denying that, there's no debating that, and certainly I'm not suggesting that the Atelier games, when I say they're absolutely gorgeous, are in any way, shape or form comparable to the AAA space in terms of the quality of the technology. But when I talk about the Atelier games being gorgeous, and I do think they're absolutely stunning, and I would prefer to look at the art of a game like this than something like Assassin's Creed or Doom or whatever. When I say that these games are gorgeous, what I'm referring to is the art direction, and one of the things that I find so fascinating in the games industry is that when people talk about what good graphics are, and I put good graphics in kind of inverted commas because that's what people tend to phrase it as, it's good graphics. What good graphics are to a lot of people is this kind of real hyper realism where, you know, everything needs to be as detailed and as realistic and as gritty and as real as possible, and that's where a lot of the development budgets go into. You look at Assassin's Creed or GTA or, you know, any of those kinds of games, the money that's invested in the art is invested in making everything look real, people move real, the lip syncing being completely accurate, all that kind of stuff, and that is very expensive to do, and it looks good on an objective point of view. But for me, the thing that I find so interesting is that in basically every kind of other art space there is, people have moved on from this idea that realism is the thing to strive for. I spend a lot of time going to art galleries and reading art books and studying art itself, and realism's the kind of thing that as an artist you move on from once you've got that base level of technical ability. People learn how to do things realistically when they're learning the basics of how to construct an artwork, but once they get to a certain level of expertise, they're expected to kind of start to develop their own style and approach and take influence from other artists who themselves were not realistic. So, I mean, if you go to an art gallery, you're more likely to go to a Picasso exhibition, or a Monet, or a Salvador Dali, or a Jackson Pollock, than you are to go to somebody who's painted realistic style paintings. It's just, realism is just not the thing that people aim for. People look to use art as a way of telling story and conveying meaning, and to do that, you need to do something a little bit more than just be realistic. You need to find an art style that really kind of speaks to the messages that you're looking to push out. So when it comes to games industry and talking about the games industry, the thing that I always find so interesting is that this idea that good graphics has to be realistic, when realism itself is not something that really does anything in terms of art. It just represents, it doesn't tell a story of its own. It's just a foundation, and then on top of that you need to build a narrative and all that kind of stuff in, which is what the AAA space does. But a more abstract art style can be part of the storytelling message in itself, and I think that's where a game like Atelier or Blue Reflection, I think that's where those kinds of games really speak to me, because they are highly abstracted, and because they are highly abstracted, they're quite beautiful. They're designed around aesthetics, and they're quite happy to break the rules of the world in order to make everything look more beautiful and more elegant and more clean and more bright and more vibrant, or whatever the developer's going for with at that point of time. The other thing that I find so interesting about this desire to do realistic art and realistic graphics and good graphics is the reality is that realism doesn't age very well, and this is something that we have seen in the industry over every single generation of console. What is realistic and what is good graphics in one generation ages poorly by the next. So if you were to think of, on the PlayStation 1, something like Final Fantasy VIII really aimed for that kind of realism in the character models especially, but also architecture and landscape designs and all those kinds of things aimed for this breathtakingly realistic world. And at the time it was celebrated for those graphics, and fair enough, and it still looks playable. It's playable enough by today's standards, but it has aged poorly. No one would look at it today and say those are great graphics. And you look through to the PlayStation 2, that happened again. Killzone, for instance, was lauded for its amazing graphics and amazing animation engine and all that kind of stuff, but it has aged poorly. The original Killzone, nobody would look at today and say it's comparable to anything that's released in the modern era. And Tomb Raider is another great example. Lara Croft and all the controversy she caused, her character model today looks ridiculous, and all the conversations about how sexy it was and all that stuff back in the day, nobody have those conversations with that particular character model anymore, and so on and so forth. You look forward to today, and I can guarantee you that Horizon and The Last of Us and the Call of Duties that are out today, in a couple of generations, will look dated and old. Now, contrast that with a more abstract approach to art, and it's quite easy to see that those games age better. And I give you a perfect example is from the Super Nintendo, actually. The Final Fantasies of those days, with their pixel art and their very simple, but very abstracted, but highly thematically designed character sprites, enemy sprites, all the world design, all of that kind of stuff. That game is still good looking today, and when Square Enix goes and tries to change the sprite models and things, it actually upsets people because it doesn't look as good anymore to a lot of people. And that's something that when you do something that's highly abstract, you give it a more timeless quality, where people, generations from now, can look back at it and say, hey, you know what, this this game still looks good, or this artwork still looks good, because it has its own style and it has its own message. And I mean, when I look at the earlier Atelier games that I played, for example, Atelier Verona on the PlayStation 3, the first Atelier I played, it still looks every bit as impressive to me as it did when it was new. I haven't changed how my eyes interpret that game. Whereas if I was to look at some of the more realistic PlayStation 3 games and compare them to how they look even now compared to what the PlayStation 4 Pro can do, for example, it's just not comparable. And you know, those games are already starting to age. Atelier Verona has that timeless quality because it is so heavily abstracted and so cartoonish in approach. So I think that's an important thing that the games industry should start to consider a little bit more carefully, is this idea that realism is the only approach to good graphics is, for a lot of developers who don't have the massive budgets, limiting. It would be much better for especially mid-tier developers who often attempt to do something realistic. Those mid-tier developers would be so much better off attempting to do something much more highly abstracted and clean and elegant and kind of timeless, and then having people discover that game for generations afterwards, you know, keep coming back to it. The chances are that a timeless looking game will be one that people, you know, 2 or 3 console cycles down the track will still buy because it's still attractive to them. It's still artistic. I can't, unless you do a kind of HD remaster of a current generation blockbuster game, it's going to lose its value very quickly to the developer and publisher soon after. So yeah, it's a topic I think is worth talking about a lot. I think people miss it a lot. I think there's still that perception that good graphics can only be one approach. And I really wish that people would look at something like Atelier or Blue Reflection and kind of see the actual, the quality of the art direction being the significant thing, not so much the technical merits. So thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you at the next video.